Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 11th of November, and wow, we have a lot of updates to get to today. We're going to begin by looking at Kurakhove and make our way all the way up north to Kursk. Before that though, I do want to entertain some of the reporting coming out of Zaporizhia, and I do promise that the upload schedule will begin to improve over the next week and 2 weeks, so hopefully you guys will look forward to that as I'm going to try to be more consistent in the near future. Beginning with Zaporizhia, there are unconfirmed reports from the Ukrainian side, mainly from the Ukrainian side. I've seen it less so coming from the Russians in relation to movement and advances of the Russian forces near Huliapoli. As you can see on the map, Huliapoli, there is this large swath of open fields in between the southern perimeter of the city and a lot of contact where the Russians have their clusters of troops, which appear to be, based on just like open source information, relatively small. It's like a 5 kilometer gap at most between the trenches in the line of contact, and it could be at most 7 kilometers. So it really is a large area, which probably is mined, but you do have a lack of density in defenses and of manpower for the Ukrainian side. Huliapoli really has the strength of it has been evaporated and moved really anywhere else, because really this area has been one of the least violent, one of the least active, and so the Ukrainians had no other choice but to move forces elsewhere, usually nearby to regions like Velika Novosilka, and then by extension moving them away to other parts of the front line. And so then this really doesn't receive the proper amount of defensive manning, meaning that there is always a possibility for the Russians to increase the tempo. But even looking at the Russian perspective, it's not like they have a massive concentration of forces here, unless there was some sort of movement in relation to the local garrisons, perhaps from the Orkiv sector or nearby, that I didn't pick up on. Regardless of that fact, more generally, the Ukrainians are reporting an uptick of between 30 to 40% in the amount of aircraft strikes, mainly the cab bombs, but some guided bombs, unguided bombs being launched from the Russian Air Force. Really, the uptick has been noticed in recent times, and it is very stark. At the same time, you have the movement of trained Russian assault groups closer to the line of contact, preparations being made with armored vehicles, mainly lighter ones like buggies. So you have the Chinese Desert Crosses mainly being used, and motorcycles, preparation with a large amount of drones being sent to the front line. 76th VDV Division is a large part of the Russian makeup, the composition that remains in Zaporizhia, and so a lot of their staging points and vehicle clusters were actually struck by the Ukrainians using cluster munitions. And so we know of some sort of movement around here, but there isn't any clear indication as to the Russian intention in surrounding Huliapoli. What we have a more clear view about is actually on the border between Zaporizhia and Donetsk, and that is because Deep State is reporting on a large-scale Russian assault that started around today, trying to take over Makarivka and Rivnopil slightly to the west. This would be a part of Russia's broader, I suppose, actions in this region, which started off with the very successful assault towards Staromyrsk, and then the battle that really pushed out the Ukrainians from Maruzhnia. That was very hard fought, and since then sort of expanded northwards gradually. At the same time, the Russians have strongly secured flanks to the west and areas near Levadne, making it easier and really paving a very clear path to assault Rivnopil. And then also from the east over here, you have the Russians generally improving their positions in regions surrounding Maruzhnia, and of course, given everything that's going on around Novodonetsk and Zolotoniva, the Russian advances there over the past month, it makes it easier to have some sort of supporting flank from the east to at least provide fire support or some sort of vantage points to overlook the situation on the battlefield. And so then all those conditions combined make it much more conducive now for the Russians to launch a larger scale head-on attack towards the Ukrainian holdings in very small villages that are reliant on one specific logistical route to connect to Velika Novosilka. So that really applies to Makarivka and Rivnopil, and they're the two closest in proximity to the Russian line of contact. So that could be the rationale. Deep State, they claim that in individual attacks, the Russians are using between 50 to 60 men. That would be platoon-sized attacks, really large scale. We've seen similar sorts of sizes in relation to Staromyrsk, but I think this would be a new record given the frequency based on what Deep State's reporting. But I can't change the mapping yet. Just keep that in mind as we move forward. There may be some sort of Russian activation here. Sometimes it could be a means by which to ruse the Ukrainians into not moving forces away from Zaporizhia, and trying to prevent them from sending those reinforcements elsewhere to key parts of the front line. So it could be a sort of Maskirovka tactic. Then on the other end, it could just be the Russians taking advantage of the Ukrainians already moving away a large amount of forces from certain parts of the front line to just improve their positions there, because the opportunity presented itself, especially in the Velika Novosilka area, where the Russians outnumbered the Ukrainians at least 4-1 based on the calculations I made of the unit composition. And then Huliapoli, I can't really speak to the Russian garrison, but the Ukrainian one is very, very small. Looking a bit eastwards, though, I want to focus on the Uspanivka and, I suppose, more aptly named Andriivka directions. You can see that over the past 2 to 3 days, the Russian forces have improved local positions east of Maximivka and also north of Bokhoyevlenka. Again, this is a part of what I've described previously. We're looking at so many swaths of fields, and in each one you have individual tree lines where there is the suspicion of Ukrainians remaining, or some sort of dugout that has to be cleared. Mines are there, so you have to be very careful while clearing it. And then you also don't want to really stray too deep into the line of contact, or past the line of contact rather, and then be exposed to some sort of Ukrainian drone fire, artillery strikes, or direct fire from wherever the Ukrainians are reorganizing. And so that's why it's taking some time. And again, we're looking at an accelerated pace, so it's all relative. But the Russians definitely have had a couple of days, and now it's probably a week and a half of just trying to consolidate positions in these fields east and west of villages that they already captured. They were able to capture them very quickly due to the spearheads overwhelming the local Ukrainian garrisons, and now they're just trying to consolidate everything in between. Let's look at actually the extent of the Russian advance. Here it's 7.2 square kilometers, and north of Bokhoyevlenka it's 4.1 square kilometers. And this one is important because it's leading directly towards Trudove, which is one of those intermediary Ukrainian defense posts, because you have the line of contact where the Russians are currently operating near these ponds, and then you have Uspanivka, and the only thing in between is Trudove. You also have this very, very small buffer zone of open fields amounting to 2.3 kilometers between the chain of Ukrainian villages leading to the most extreme part of the line of contact, most southeastern parts of it, I suppose you would say. And that's really a small distance. The Russians really have taken over a large chunk of these fields that were previously under the Ukrainian buffer zone control, and a lot of it is on higher elevation that definitely overlooks the chain of villages mentioned over here. More generally, you have this large-scale pocket that has formed, and it starts out with Uspanivka. Uspanivka is essentially the outlet for it, and it spans this entire red rectangle. This is becoming very, very untenable for the Ukrainian side from several axes. You have, first of all, from the south over here, although the pressure here isn't at its maximum right now. Same thing with this pressure over here directly from the east. You have battles going on in, right next to Ilinka and also in Yelizavetivka. You have new pushes that we're going to get to in a second coming out of Kostantinivka, because, again, now a lot of Russian columns and troops can organize and attack from these regions. Great positions for local platoons to branch out from. You also, of course, have what is the most potent axis, and that would be directly through these open fields that are south of Maximilianivka, pushing westwards just south of Kurakhove, in areas that really should have been better defended. But the Russians found a gap over here, not a gap in terms of trenches, but a gap in the strength of the actual Ukrainian military, and were able to make it all the way to Dalnya. And we're going to get to that as well in a second. But you can see how all of these various angles of pressure, they will reach some sort of boiling point, and then it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainian garrison in this salient to continue holding on, in the same way it was difficult for the Ukrainians with the Vovcha River salient that we talked about, and the same way it's difficult with the salient that is currently forming in between Sonsivka and Ilinka within this red rectangle. Just so many of these cauldrons are being formed, and that's because the Russians really have structured their attacks in such a way where that would happen, but also because the Ukrainians, in scenarios where their flanks are being pressured, they still remain head first, trying to be committed to not withdrawing from said pockets. And so then that sort of exacerbates the phenomenon. Also, you look at the flanks, for instance, in an area like Maximivka, and the Ukrainian quality of troops is much worse than it is with the Ukrainians that are actually defending head on, because here you have territorial defense units that are really doing most of the defense. And you have a few other elements like the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, which hasn't had that much intense combat experience over the past year. Then looking at the units that are defending head on, you have the 79th Air Assault Brigade, really strong unit, 33rd Mechanized Brigade. They're doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to at least trying to repel assaults and then pushing back and localized counterattacks. So definitely there is a contrast over there, and it's also a reflection of Ukraine's priorities. But also Zelensky gave the approval to send in reinforcements to this pocket. He talked about sending in mobile firing squads to this area. So that's a euphemism for more reinforcements being moved into this region. Looking at this polygon, you could see the Russians advancing 6 square kilometers. This is west of the highway that connects Konstantinivka to Pobeda. I'll show it to you guys over here. That's the highway. And the Russians, for a while, they spent a lot of effort clearing out trenches just west of that highway. I'm going to mark that with an X. And now that they've succeeded in doing that, everything that comes west of it is much easier to take over because you're looking at armored vehicles being able to push rather deep without the fear of having some sort of like attack from a Ukrainian soldier popping out of a dugout or like flanking him somewhere. And so now you're able to get these deeper advances through what's largely a gray zone because the Ukrainian reinforcements or whatever vanguard they have left are a bit further to the west. And that's why you're seeing these advances right now. And they're going to continue along this axis, which then presents threats for Ilinka and Yelizavetivka, even though they're already engaged in fierce battles head-on. Now, the most important area to look at, and the area that I suppose you could say gave really amounts to 27 square kilometers in size, is this really important polygon. This polygon indicating Russian control over a large chunk of the open fields south of the highway that connects to Kurakhove to the north over here. And so this region, it includes mainly fields. A lot of them are rectangular fields, and they have large parallel tree lines. You can see them marked on the map. So really perfect positions for holding out, but not that many well-built trenches within them or around them. You have a few that are located a bit to the east that really aren't relevant for the Russian advances at the moment. And then you have this sort of route that vehicles could have used, this sort of like local ravine that pushes into the outskirts of Kurakhove. So that's another part of this entire equation. But the Russian vector of advance that really is important is the one that branched out of earlier gains that occurred southwest of Maximilianivka. You can see it over here. This was the initial Russian push over the past couple of weeks. Really important because it gave the Russians an established base within this ravine and within the first trenches of the Kurakhove perimeter. And from there, they had a very clear route fleshed out, and the Ukrainians couldn't, approach them as closely and had to fall back in certain instances, and really emboldened the Russians to launch even larger attacks. And of course, there's very heavy vehicular damage as well. That's obviously not being denied. You could see the footage for yourself on the map, but then some of the vehicles, they slipped through the cracks, dismounted forces, and then the Overton window was shifted even further westwards. So that's been the story of this front. So here, November 8th, Russian column comes under fire southeast of Kurakhove. That was the movement 3 days ago. And then you can see the progression because on November 10th, you had the 33rd Brigade. Again, they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Their artillery and FPV crews, in addition to a Leopard 2A4 tank and M113s, they fired onto various tree lines located south of Kurakhove where there were Russian troops stationed after dismounting from vehicles. And also a lot of those troops, they probably advanced through these trenches that are linear and wide encompassing. They provide excellent routes for troops to move in a area that they might be guided through to reach deeper towards key Ukrainian locations. And so definitely the Russians took advantage of that, and it's preferable to advancing through an open field. Probably the best solution would be to advance through tree lines, of course. And then on November 11th, this is the most interesting video because it shows 2 tanks and 6 armored vehicles from the Russian side getting destroyed. But on the other hand, it shows that they had the ability to enter into Dalnya, and we don't know the status of the troops there. All of them, certainly some of them were taken as casualties because, of course, due to direct hits by FPVs or artillery. Also, I do believe Leopards were involved with the attacks here, trying to repel the Russian tanks and armored vehicles. But besides that, troops that get out and try to hide in trenches or in the open fields, they get picked off by drones. So there's always a certain level of casualties. According to the Ukrainian side, and I can't confirm this, they say that 29 Russian soldiers were killed in this assault and that 19 of them were wounded. But again, what this indicates to me is that the Ukrainians were severely weakened over here. The fact that the Russians can even penetrate into this village which is so critical when you look at it because it's located directly south of the city that is meant to be defended. The entire operational goal for the Ukrainians here is to hold out in Kurakhove, and they can't even have a solid defensive structure with actual troops embedded within the town just south of it that has a paved road connecting directly to Kurakhove and is located just a couple of kilometers south. Also, is the entrance to the entire labyrinth of trenches over here. So that's very concerning, not to mention the fact that using the same road you connect to Uspenivska. So all in all, it's extremely concerning that the Russians were able to penetrate here in what was their first attempt to actually send in vehicles directly into the village. But of course, the solace and the silver lining for the Ukrainians is the fact that they can send in mobile crews of tankers and armored vehicles to push them out. But that's different than having a solid group of forces hiding or embedded here. And if that can't be done, then eventually the Russians will be able to take it over. And that would just have a really large amount of consequences for Kurakhove. As right now, based on the current projection of where the Russians are located, it's only about 3 kilometers to the south of the city itself, and well within the range of localized fire, short range fire towards the entire perimeter of the trenches and all of the logistics leading into Kurakhove. Now, in addition to all this, you have direct Russian advances. You could see just east of the city, amounting to 1.5 square kilometers. There may be some other very small movements on the eastern periphery, like directly into residential buildings, but so far not anything confirmed across the Vavcha River and across the rail line over here. Also, there's a lot of talk about the Ukrainians no longer being present within this important salient, the salient that spans from the eastern edge all the way to Sontsivka. It's an area that spans 9.5 kilometers and then let's see, so 5 kilometers going north to south. So this is a really important area because it just serves as a buffer, an opportunity for the Ukrainians to buy time, lest the Russians be able to advance further westwards all the way to the eastern outskirts of Andriivka. So that was the entire point, just to give some the Ukrainians on the rear some breathing space. But all of that was put into peril with the Russian advance into Sontsivka itself, which threatened the integrity of the flanks of said salient. So the Russians advanced here at least 6.3 kilometers. And we know of their presence within the town based on this Instagram video from the Ukrainian side. It shows that there was machine gun fire at the Russian side. They claim actually that there were 2 successive assaults occurring on, I believe, the 7th and 8th. And then those continue with armored vehicles into November 9th. And so that was already 2 days ago. And in that time period, there has not been an additional clarification about the state of Sontsivka. It appears that either there are battles going on over here right now or that the Russians took it over. And the reason why I say that is because of the explosion that occurred at Stary Tyranny. There was a explosion at the dam over here. There is a dam that, of course, is related to the Kurakhove reservoir because there is actually a thermal power plant in Kurakhove. And so the reservoir to the north provides the cooling for that. And the dam is located in Stary Tyranny. It exploded. And as a result, over the past couple of hours, there has been a rise in the sea levels in the area just to the west with the entire Vavcha River Valley. This extends to areas like Shevchenko. It should extend to, I suppose, Ulakli and then Andriivka most notably. But besides that, even further westwards, it would cause some issues with Bakhitir or Oleksivka. So far in those regions, there's not reporting of any flooding in houses, which is good. But in terms of sea level, it is increased by 1.2 meters in this river, especially in close proximity to the dam itself. So the flooding is beginning to see some effects, and then there will be some sort of draining in the reservoir itself. Now, the reason why I think that the Ukrainians may not be in Sontsivka anymore is because there's a pretty good possibility that they were the ones who did it, although they blame the Russians. Just looking at it logically, all the areas that are currently going to be flooded, they are located just to the south of Sontsivka, and a lot of them east of Andriivka. That's important because the Russian vector that is currently occurring around Sontsivka, That presented a critical threat to Kurakhove because the opportunity for the Russian forces to continue advancing southwards, cut off this paved road that you see over here, and then make it to Dakhny and cut off another paved road, a highway. That would essentially neuter any attempts by the Ukrainians to continue defense in Kurakhove. It would really mean that the impetus would be on the Ukrainians to withdraw from Kurakhove immediately. And with the advance in Sontsivka, that was definitely a reality that could unfold, not just with Kurakhove, but also with more generally the entire salient surrounding it, and of course the salient north of the reservoir. So then the flooding here, that definitely will have an effect of slowing down and then increasing the width of the river, which the Russians have to cross over if they want to cut off these two roads and if they want to cut off the western entrance into Kurakhove. And so then it serves the advantage of prolonging and delaying the eventual Russian push from the west, from the sort of, I suppose, northern flank to cut off Kurakhove in its entirety. So that's the benefit for the Russians. But then from the other side, you could look at it and say that the Ukrainians, a lot of their trenches, a lot of their positions in suburbs east of Andriivka, like Shevchenko and Dakhny, they will be damaged due to the flooding. And so then it will be more difficult for them to man those static positions that are located at the outskirts of a very important city such as Andriivka. But I'll show you guys a photo. So here you can see the damage done to the dam, and then you can see as well some of the initial effects of the flooding. Now moving northwards, you also have Russian movement occurring on the Post-Selydove front. I don't necessarily know what to call it because it is north of Andriivka. And this is an area that I do believe is very exposed, and I've talked about it numerous times. This entire region that is in between Andriivka and Pokrovsk really lacks in built-up vertical trench lines. Right now, the Ukrainians are compensating for that by moving in a large amount of reinforcements to this area, and so that could play a role in, holding out and preventing deep Russian pushes. Also, from the Russian perspective, they don't have that many men committed to areas that are just north of Sontsivka and I suppose just south of Selydove. So perhaps that could also be an explanation for why the scale of the advances is a bit smaller than it is in other parts of the front line. But regardless, the Russians are advancing, and they made that very well known with their capture of Novo-Oleksivka. They also advanced south of it, 1.6 square kilometers. Let's see what this geolocation shows. This is from November 9th. This is from the 137th Battalion of the 35th Marine Brigade, just on FPV strikes of individual Russian soldiers advancing through these tree lines, clearing them out. Not as much of a worry of built-up fortresses in each of these tree lines as there is in other parts of the front line. Just to the north here, you have the Russians advancing from, I suppose, the outskirts of Selydove, pushing along the rail line, also sometimes pushing directly from the south through the fields, making it into southern parts of Petrivka. So Petrivka is currently in a gray zone. The fighting continues there. Same with Hrihorivka. Russians making an effort to clear out the positions that the Ukrainians consolidated a couple of weeks ago in following the fall of Selydove, trying to ensure that it does not become a permanent Ukrainian fallback line and that there is a strong basis for pressure south of Pokrovsk, and also, I suppose, a means by which to eventually reach the highway that vertically connects Andriivka to Pokrovsk. Sorry, it's about 9 kilometers away right now, and that really is important to keep an eye out for, because at this point, any sort of large-scale Ukrainian building of defenses is impossible in this highway region. It's simply too close. It would come under intense Russian fire. So the Ukrainians really are forced to begin building up their large-scale trench programs directly on the border between Donetsk and Dnipro, which is something that they really would not have liked to do in the first place. Looking here, the Russians advanced 3.5 square kilometers northwards, taking over additional portions of the E50 highway. Here's the geolocation from November 9th of 3 Russian armored vehicles getting destroyed by mines. It was filmed by the 68th Jaeger Brigade. Now, to just briefly look at Toretsk, I want to show some small updates. Russian forces along a very narrow route advanced. This is very, very close to the industrial parts of the city, which is basically a core part. It's part of the nucleus of Toretsk. Here you actually have the landfills that dominate the entire battlefield. So the Russians really are getting close to that, in addition to some of the other facilities nearby. At the same time, the Ukrainians continue making efforts to push the Russians out of the Citadel region in just areas just north of it. There's a few geolocations of the Ukrainian presence in this area, which you can see with this lighter blue polygon. These are some of the recent Ukrainian counterattacks that have been successful in taking local buildings. And then also over here, the Ukrainians have been successful in pushing back in the private residential area based on footage from the Neptune Assault Detachment, which is a part of the DPR's 132nd Motorized Rifle Brigade. Their grenades, they were dropped onto Ukrainian concentrations near a vehicle that dismounted troops that's actually pretty close to the front line. Also, I don't know how I mentioned this earlier or how I didn't, but the 114th Motorized Rifle Brigade, they raised their flag in Novoselidivka, so that's after they raised it in Stepanivka, Vovchenka, etc. Now they moved a bit to the north and are engaged in the battles here. They've definitely taken over the central part of the village, but there is still a question mark surrounding the western portion, which includes a warehouse region. Then also, Russian sources claim that they've captured Voznesenko, so keep an eye out for whatever developments occur over there. Now, moving on to the Kursk region, interestingly, Ukrainian sources talk about the Russians moving in additional units, including the 104th Regiment of the 76th VDV Division. Very important to keep in mind because it was previously operating around Zaporizhia, and we talked about all of the events unfolding over there or the rumors surrounding them. But in actuality, the Russians are apparently going to move one regiment from the area to attack in the Kursk region, and they're almost exclusively now taking from those VDV elements some of their best equipped and most experienced forces to assist with the continued operations with the counterattacks that have now really started to uptick in tempo in this region. You also have reports of several battalions of the 177th Naval Infantry Regiment being moved to Kursk. I believe that it is currently operating in the Kherson region, so definitely something to keep an eye on for. Looking a bit to the south, there is this video from the 129th Territorial Defense Brigade, specifically their rugby drone units. So it showed an attack by said drone elements onto 7 Russian soldiers that were crossing over the Psal River. This is actually pretty deep into the Ukrainian lines when you look at it in comparison to where the Russians may be located. It's about 3 kilometers to the west, and it appears that the Russians were crossing over from north to south, I believe. Something looking like this, so they probably came from Fanisivka, although there is a lot of ambiguity as to whether those areas are under solid Russian control, because this region is just very difficult to maintain control over. Very small squads operate here, and you have just floodplains and marshy regions, so just becomes very complicated to get a clear understanding of where's every single unit located, where's every single troop located. But again, the squad here, the 7 troops that were crossing over the river with the boats, most of them were killed per the video, and the attack was repelled. Looking into the north, a lot of the movement that's been reported has come around Pogrebki. We know that the large-scale attack started on November 7th, and over the past 4 days, they have continued, although at least today, the scale and intensity was less so than it was November 7th, November 8th, November 9th. Because there were some very large-scale attacks, including, I believe, with 15 BTR-82s pushing southwards towards Pogrebki, making it even further south to Orlovka and Novaya Sorchina. And Russian sources actually claimed control over these 3 villages, this cluster of villages. And also, they claimed that they were able to reach the northern outskirts of Sorochina. But since then, the Ukrainians have claimed that they succeeded in counterattacking, and that now there is a fluid state between the Russian and Ukrainian lines, as the Russians have not given up on the attacks and they continue going on. So you can't really say that either side has solid control inside the regions. But in terms of the deepest extent of a Russian advance, I don't know why I don't have it labeled here, but this is from November 10th. The video was geolocated, but I think it's from November 7th actually. And in comparison to where I currently have the line of contact marked just north of Pogrebki, it is about 3 kilometers southwards. So that was a deep penetration. And more generally, all these fields to the west and also these very dense forested areas, a lot of them are no longer under Ukrainian control, as the Ukrainians really focus on maintaining their presence in known villages and nearby, not necessarily in these sort of overstretched tree lines. So eventually the Russians had the opportunity to consolidate control in those areas. Now, to the south, you have very heavy clashes in Zeleny Shlaich, with the Russians maintaining control there. They have control over much of western Novoivanovka, but the eastern portion is either a gray zone or under Ukrainian control. Here you have a video from November 11th of a BMP-1, a Russian BMP-1, dismounting its forces in Novoivanovka. It was hit by an RPG during the movement, but it was not destroyed as a result. It was able to continue moving. There's a few other videos. This one from November 8th from the 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade. Their tanks fired onto Russian dugouts in the village, indicating a Russian presence here, that definitely the Ukrainians are trying to uproot. They're trying to get rid of this entire salient that extends from Novoivanovka all the way to Lyubimovka. But so far, both the Russian and Ukrainian attacks have not been able to move the needle that much in this area. And every single time there's some sort of back and forth, like the 47th Mechanized Brigade, they sent in 2 Bradley crews to fire towards the Russian side recently. And the Russian side, they're also conducting regular attacks. According to Ukrainian sources, actually, they claim the Russians today lost 3 BMP-2s, 4 BTR-82s, 2 T-80s, 2 MTLBs, and 5 BMP-3s. And then in the Pogrebki direction, which, again, we talked about earlier, they claim that they destroyed 1 T-72, 1 BTR-82, and then 2 of the Akhmat MRAPs. The attacks that are currently going on the western flank of Novoivanovka, those are largely being conducted by the 51st VDV Regiment. That's a relatively known one. You also have the 155th Marine Brigade. They're operating here. And then to the north, the Naval Infantry Brigade, 110th. They're the ones that are doing much of the movement around Pogrebki. So definitely keep that in mind. But actually, the region where we saw the most movement was further south, where the Russians actually made it into the Reno. We have a video of it. I want to click on it here. It's from November 11th. It's of FPV strikes that the Russians conducted towards the Ukrainian remnants before actually moving in with their own troops on foot. And those troops individually cleared out the houses in the Reno. They, used small arms. They threw grenades to clear out basements. And they made their presence known as the Ukrainians withdrew. And so now you have finally across the Sonogost River a Ukrainian Russian foothold that will put pressure onto Nikolaevka, the Reno, onto Nizhny Klin here, and more generally onto Sverdlikovo, which is very important because it acts right now as a conduit for the Ukrainian counterattacks that are occurring further north in Leonidovo and Novoivanovka, and also as a connection to Suja. So all of that is important, and the Russians were able to advance here 16 square kilometers. So that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.